Next year will be the 30th anniversary of the creation of the Premier League, English football's breakaway top flight, spearheaded by the old First Division's 5 biggest clubs, as they were perceived at that time. Since then, 11 different men from 7 different countries have won the top flight of English football as managers. So, how many of them do you suppose were from England? You know, the country in which the league is actually based. That's right, not a single one, in almost 30 years. And you can bet your bottom dollar that we will go a full 3 decades with that record still intact, unless Aston Villa go full 2015-16 Leicester City on us next season. A Chilean manager has won the Premier League title, but an Englishman has not. 4 different Italians won the Premier League title between 2010 and 2017 alone, but not a single English man or woman has ever lifted the nation's most prestigious title. Over in Spain, over the last 20 years, from the 1999-2000 to the 2019-20 seasons, the La Liga title has been won by a Spanish manager on 13 occasions, and won by a foreign manager just 8 times. In Italy, Jose Mourinho is the only non-Italian to have lifted the Serie A title in the last 2 decades. And though the Ligue 1 title has seen a bit more variation just in recent years, between Argentine boss Luis Carniglia winning the Ligue 1 title with Nice in 1956 and Leonardo Jardim lifting the Ligue 1 Uber Eats Subway foot-long sandwich with extra jalapeno peppers trophy, or whatever it's called these days, in 2017, the top flight of French football was only won by 4 foreign managers in more than 6 decades. It's a similar story in all the major European competitions. The last time an English manager lifted the Champions League, well, there was no Champions League. It was still called the European Cup, because that man was Joe Fagan at Liverpool in 1984. The last time an English manager won the Europa League, well, again, it wasn't called the Europa League, it was called the UEFA Cup, and oddly enough, it was also in 1984. And it was Keith Birkinshaw, whose Tottenham Hotspur team finally beat Anderlecht in the second leg of their final at White Hart Lane on penalties. And the World Cup? Well, you can probably guess that one. It's 1966. Though, there's no great shame in that, given that a foreign manager has never won the World Cup. Only ever a manager managing their own domestic national team. So, there is a fun, albeit totally irrelevant fact. Nonetheless, you can see that English managers are a real anomaly within the context, at least of Europe's top leagues, in their remarkable lack of success. And the stats only bear out what most of us already know. But why is this the case? Well, there is one particular school of thought, unsurprisingly favoured by English football managers, that goes roughly like this. English managers are considered to be unglamorous, and therefore they are overlooked, particularly in terms of the top jobs, despite being more than capable and having earned their stripes. Basically, no one wants pasty old Simon Grayson at the Emirates, despite the fact that he is up to the job. That's why Phil Brown spends so long on the tanning beds, just to try and land a top job. It's tantamount to racism, Jeff. Actually, it's worse than that. It's reverse racism. It is a disgrace, Jeff. Alright, I'm parodying the point a little bit, but seriously, only a little bit. If I was called Aladicio, I could have managed Manchester United. Sam Allardyce famously told professional meat inside of a sausage roll impersonator Alan Brazil on TalkSport in 2019. It's not the first time this argument has been made. I'm 99% sure that I can recall a manager or pundit stating on BBC Radio 5 Live, when Paul Clement was enjoying a rich vein of form as manager of Swansea City, that if his name was Paolo Clemente, then he would be being talked about as Arsene Wenger's successor at Arsenal. And maybe they're right. That is, after all, how Roberto Martinez got his start in management at Swansea City, by changing his name from Robert Martin to Roberto Martinez and claiming to be a UEFA qualified coach when he was actually a disgraced former gas engineer from Crawley who had been imprisoned for 12 months after claiming to be on the gas safe register when he wasn't. And then he just fluked his way up from Swansea to Wigan, Wigan to Everton, and now with the Belgian national team. No, not really. And despite my gentle ribbing, it's not really fair to analyse the merits of a suggestion or argument based upon the least legitimate and persuasive way in which it has been made. Sam Allardyce has made these types of claims more than anyone else, but in 2008, when Mark Hughes was sacked by Manchester City and replaced by Roberto Mancini, a number of managers took a dim view of a British manager being replaced with an Italian. Steve Bruce told the press, "If we are not careful, all the jobs seem to be going to foreign coaches. I can't see many English or British coaches working in their countries, working in Germany or Spain or Italy." I think Bruce, rather inadvertently, makes quite a good point relating to English managers there. But we'll come to that in a moment. Sean Dyche, who I think has undeniably done an outstanding job at Burnley, has made similar comments, claiming in 2016 that he would get more credit if he were a foreign manager. And less than a year ago, former England goalkeeper Paul Robinson told Football Insider that he felt Steve Bruce, Sam Allardyce and Sean Dyche were all deserving of an opportunity at one of the top clubs. The most outstanding example of this complaint, though, has to be when Paul Merson and Phil Thompson teamed up on Sky Sports' Gillette Soccer Saturday to lambast the appointment of Marco Silva as the new manager of Hull City, in a segment that began with Merce bemoaning, "Why's it always gotta be a foreign manager?" A reminder, by the way, that Merce was making these comments about Marco Silva, who had just replaced Mike Phelan at the KCOM Stadium, whose own predecessor was Steve Bruce, both of whom, I hope you'd agree, are quite English. Merce and Tomo joined in a chorus of, "What does he know about the Premier League? What does he know about Hull?" And he hasn't got a clue, before concluding with the single word, baffling. Of course, Silva actually did a very good job in East Yorkshire, turning Hull City's fortunes around, but failing to keep the club in the division following a trio of defeats at the end of the campaign. Not that any of that really matters. So, is it true that English or British managers don't get opportunities at the top clubs? Well, of the so-called Big Six, in financial terms at least, we have seen Frank Lampard at Chelsea, David Moyes at Manchester United, Roy Hodgson and Brendan Rodgers at Liverpool, and both Harry Redknapp and Tim Sherwood at Tottenham Hotspur in relatively recent years. That seems like a fair old crack of the whip to me, and if we're honest, some of them just weren't very good. Redknapp and Rodgers both had good and bad seasons at Tottenham and Liverpool respectively. Moyes didn't get long, but he took Manchester United from title winners to 7th place. Hodgson was a complete disaster. Sherwood was never fit to manage a Sunday League team, never mind a Premier League team. And Frank Lampard got one of the top jobs in the country after miraculously guiding Derby County from the lowly depths of a 6th place finish in the Championship all the way to the dizzying heights of a 6th place finish in the Championship, despite having Mason Mount, Fikayo Tomori and Harry Wilson on loan at the club. In fact, I think you could argue, and this leans a little bit into my recent Nepotism in Football documentary, that it is precisely because of the fact that they are English, their connections within the game, and their reputations as players that Tim Sherwood and Frank Lampard landed Premier League jobs at all. It is less true, I believe, to say that hungry and talented English managers are being overlooked in favour of foreign managers than it is to say hungry and talented English managers are just being overlooked in favour of not very good English managers. So, in truth, I think it is a dubious claim to make that English or British managers don't get opportunities at the top clubs. I think at just about every juncture where there was an overwhelmingly obvious English candidate for a job, they have been offered it. And even when they haven't been the obvious choice, sometimes they still have. But let's just take the likes of Sam Allardyce and Paul Merson's word for it, just for a moment, and assume that there is a considerable bias against English managers and that they are denied jobs despite their records being worthy of them being offered them. Why might this be the case? I think one explanation at least is to do with style. It is not enough anymore, particularly at the top clubs, but to a certain extent even further down the footballing food chain, simply to grind out results. Unless you are so good at grinding out results that you are winning trophy after trophy, fans and owners are now demanding more than results. They're looking for a project, a brand, some kind of footballing philosophy. Everyone knows the way in which Pep Guardiola, Jurgen Klopp or Thomas Tuchel want their teams to play, but can you really nail down the way in which a Paul Cook team wishes to play? And when you can nail down an English manager with a specific style, whether that be in the case of Sam Allardyce or Tony Pulis, that is a style which tends to be viewed as being undesirable among the bigger clubs. And, as I said, to a certain extent, even the smaller teams now as well. This is, at the very least, the perception of English managers, even if it isn't necessarily the reality in a number of cases. Steve McClaren, who I think is among the most considered voices on this topic, and is among a select few English managers to have tried their hands overseas, and the even more select few to have tasted any success doing so, described those outside of Britain as considering English managers to have what he called an island mentality. That is to say, reluctant to travel abroad, hesitant of learning new languages, new cultures, new ideas, perhaps sometimes suffering from a case of British or English exceptionalism, and therefore often stuck in their own ways. The classic idea of an English manager is one that plays a rigid 4-4-2 and looks to play direct, long ball, and route one football. Sure, they're determined, resilient, and can be good man managers, but they are fighters, not innovators. Of course, that is a stereotype, and there are many exceptions to it, but I don't think it is coincidental that McClaren, who is among the most innovative English managers of the modern era, and among the most perceptive, is someone who is willing to take the risk of joining a Wolfsburg or an FC20. Nor do I think it is any coincidence that the most innovative and bold English manager in the Premier League right now, Graham Potter, spent the first 7 years of his career in professional management outside of the English game. If you were to say, imagine Tottenham replacing Jose Mourinho with an English manager on a permanent basis, which manager do you think they'd be most likely to approach? Personally, I think it would be Graham Potter. You could argue that the likes of Bruce, Wilder, Allardyce and Smith have all achieved more within the English game. In fact, I think that is just a fact, but I still think Spurs would prefer Potter. And so would I, in all truth. It's a similar story with Eddie Howe, who, despite suffering relegation with Bournemouth, seems far more likely to pick up a top job, or at least a pretty desirable job, than the likes of Frank Lampard, Nigel Pearson, or Sam Allardyce. Obviously, Howe is being heavily linked with the Celtic job right now, and I suspect somewhere in the region of maybe 80% of Celtic fans would take him over the aforementioned trio, in no small part down to his style of play and the idea that he could build something bigger for the future. And yes, Eddie Howe did just feature in an HITC Sevens video without me saying the word anyhow. I think this speaks to a cultural and stylistic phenomenon that means that the top teams often look abroad to make managerial appointments as much as it does to nationality. What's more, there is a bit of an elephant in the room that we ought to address, and that is the question of why Premier League teams should appoint English managers ahead of managers from any other country. I think you can make quite a solid case for why national teams ought to be managed by people from that country, and perhaps we have seen that play out with Gareth Southgate outperforming more esteemed foreign managers who preceded him. But with club sides, in the Premier League, we have the most cosmopolitan league in the world. If the owners aren't English, the managing directors aren't English, and the players aren't English, then why should the manager be any different? When Chelsea knocked Real Madrid out of the Champions League a week or so ago, there were more German players in their starting 11, the nationality of their new boss Thomas Tuchel, than there were Englishmen, the nationality of his predecessor Frank Lampard. Similarly, it's not unusual for there to be an equal or greater number of Spaniards in one of Mikel Arteta's Arsenal starting 11s than Englishmen, and it certainly makes sense for Wolves to have a Portuguese or at least Portuguese-speaking manager when they're more than capable of naming a majority Portuguese starting 11. This simply isn't the case, or at least not to such a great extent, in Ligue 1, Serie A, or the Bundesliga, where there is a much greater homegrown player bias. If 90% of your team is French, and your recruitment policy is focused primarily on signing young French players, you're probably more likely to appoint a French, or at least a French-speaking manager. For the same reason, I'd expect Sean Dyche's replacement at Burnley, when he finally leaves the Lancashire club, to be another British manager. But if Nuno Espirito Santo were to lose his job, I wouldn't necessarily expect a British manager to replace him. There's also another point that Steve Bruce made earlier, though, as I said, I think inadvertently. His point was that there are lots of foreign managers in England, but not many English managers in other countries. The implication there being, I think, pretty clearly, that English managers were overlooked both at home and abroad. But how many English managers ever actually apply for jobs in other countries? Has Steve Bruce ever applied for a job at a struggling La Liga side or at a Campeonato Brasileiro team looking to break into the Libertadores spots? Somehow, I doubt it. The lack of English managers abroad, in real terms, is actually fairly remarkable. Try and name just 3 English managers working as first-team bosses overseas right now. I'll give you a few seconds to have a think. Oh, and I'm not letting you have Gerrard at Rangers. How many have you got? Perhaps Phil Neville at Inter Miami, just because that one has been in the news recently, given the time with Bex and the class of 92. Maybe those of you who follow the MLS really closely might be aware of Adrian Heath at Minnesota United, or Gary Smith at Nashville, or even both, but I suspect not too many of you, and I would be amazed if more than 1% of people could think of any others. There are a handful more. There's Sean Constable at Moss FK in Norway's 3rd tier, there's Kevin Fallon, who manages the Cook Islands national team, and Robbie Fowler, who, at least at the time of this recording, still manages East Bengal in the Indian Super League. Actually, I suppose a few of you might have got Fowler just because this channel has a number of brilliant Indian subscribers who may be watching, and Fowler also hosts a relatively popular podcast in which he sometimes mentions his current job. You get the idea though, there really aren't very many, and I think there are a number of reasons why this is the case. Foremost among them, all the same reasons that I mentioned in the video that I made not that long ago, covering why there are so few English players abroad in some depth. So, there is the fact that the English are among the most monolingual people on the planet, England typically being the most lucrative country in which to play football, and the lack of historic precedent that makes players dream of playing overseas as a child. All of those factors apply equally, if not to an even greater extent, when it comes to managers. But there is another factor that I would add specific to managers, and that is the fear that their accomplishments outside of these shores will be viewed as somehow irrelevant or at least not on a par with successes at home. The classic example of this point is George Rayner, a Yorkshireman who guided Sweden to an Olympic gold medal and a World Cup final against Brazil, managing the likes of Lazio and Juventus between those two accomplishments. When Rayner returned to England, following more than 2 decades managing overseas, he expected the FA to offer him the England job, given England's struggles at the 1950, 1954 and 1958 World Cups, compared to his successes with the relative minnows of Sweden. But a call from the FA never came. Rayner didn't even get offered a job in the First Division. In fact, his first job back in England was at Skegness Town in the non-league game. And if you're wondering who the hell is Skegness Town, well, clearly you've never been to Skeg Vegas, but also that is rather the point. Whilst I'm sure any Englishman with a CV like Rayner's would have a flurry of Premier League teams chasing him in 2021, in addition to probably being lined up to replace Gareth Southgate, I think that fears of the unknown and a concern that you may never return at the same level that you depart still persists. I hope that the success of Graham Potter, who at least got offered a Championship gig and then a Premier League gig, will persuade English managers that that isn't the case. But we shall wait and see. Even more so than with players though, it is integral that managers take risks, try out new ideas, open up their minds and hone their skills in a variety of different environments, before hopefully bringing those fresh ideas back to these shores. At the moment, we have a situation whereby we have to import those new ideas. Pep brings tiki-taka, Klopp, the Gegenpress, Mourinho, the parked bus. Alright, that last one was a joke, but you get the idea. When was the last time that we had a genuine tactical innovation in England from an English manager? Now, that was the point that I wanted to end on until I realised that I neglected to mention another point earlier on and then I couldn't quite shoehorn it in anywhere, so I thought I'd just stick it on the end. The title of this video is framed as Why Are English Managers So Bad? Which is me playing on the perception of English managers. I don't think that English managers are bad or that they're necessarily any better or worse than managers from any other country. Certainly, there are fewer of them, just 1,400 with UEFA A or Pro licenses as of 2013, compared to 7,000 Germans and 15,000 Spaniards, which is a whole other factor. But not only do I not think English managers are necessarily quote-unquote bad, I don't think a manager is necessarily as binary as simply being labelled as good or bad. Just as certain players play better at certain clubs, in certain formations, and in certain surroundings, I think that is even more pertinent to managers. It is quite possible, I think, to be a fantastic manager of a club with very small resources looking to get up from Leagues 1 or 2 and into the Championship, but not to be a very effective manager or unable to adapt to the demands of a much wealthier club, perhaps where the expectation is winning promotion from the Championship to the Premier League. Just take someone like Roy Hodgson, who is clearly a very capable manager when it comes to managing mid-table or lower half Premier League teams. The job that he did at Fulham, West Brom, and I think still to a certain extent now at Crystal Palace is, I would say, very impressive. But he was hopeless at Liverpool and woefully unimaginative and uninspiring with England. Is Roy Hodgson a good or a bad manager? Well, I'd say he's a very good manager in the right job and not such a good manager in the wrong job. Pep Guardiola often says that he couldn't succeed without a big budget and without brilliant players. A little self-deprecatingly at times, but I think he's probably right. I suspect that if you made Pep Guardiola the manager of Luton Town, he would struggle to get that club out of the Championship. That doesn't change the fact that with a big budget and that with brilliant players, Pep is the best manager in the world. In my eyes at least, and certainly among the top few in any sane person's eyes. So just because Sean Dyche has done an excellent job at Burnley, a magnificent job even, doesn't necessarily mean that he could walk into Chelsea and perform as well as someone like Thomas Tuchel has done since his arrival. Of course, you never know until you get that opportunity, and that goes for every manager, and nearly manager, at every level. And there will be many potentially great managers that just slip through the cracks before even holding a position within the professional game. I just wanted to address that point because I think it's pretty important. There's probably another few points that I'll think of whilst editing this video or doing the images or whatever, but it's pretty lengthy already, so I shall leave it there. I enjoy doing these videos that aren't quite documentaries, but are sort of opinion pieces, I guess you'd call them, and I have made a playlist just for all of them, so feel free to check that out if you like. I'll leave a link to it on the end screen that is about to appear, as if by magic, right in front of your eyes. Thank you all as ever for watching today's video, it is much appreciated. It would also be much appreciated if you hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. Oh, and you can also find me on Twitter or Instagram by the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.